Plague of Athens was an epidemic that devastated the city-state of Athens in ancient Greece during the second year of the Peloponnesian War, 430 BC, when an Athenian victory still seemed within reach. The plague killed an estimated 75,000 to 100,000 people and is believed to have entered Athens through port city of Piraeus. Much of the eastern Mediterranean also saw an outbreak of the disease. The plague had serious effects on Athens society, resulting in a lack of adherence to laws and religious belief. Pericles, the leader of Athens, died from the plague. The plague returned twice more, in 429 BC and in 426 BC. Some 30 pathogens have been suggested as having caused the plague. In his History of the Peloponnesian War, the historian Thucydides, who was present and contracted the disease himself and survived, describes the epidemic. He writes of a disease coming from Ethiopia and passing through Egypt and Libya into the Greek world and spreading throughout the wider Mediterranean. The plague was so severe and deadly that no one could recall anywhere its like, and physicians, ignorant of its nature, not only were helpless but themselves died the fastest, having had the most contact with the sick. In overcrowded Athens, the disease killed an estimated 25% of the population. The sight of the burning funeral pyres of Athens caused the Spartans to withdraw their troops, being unwilling to risk contact with the diseased enemy. Many of Athens' infantry and expert seamen died. According to Thucydides, not until 415 BC had Athens recovered sufficiently to mount a major offensive. Antonine Plague of 165 to 180 AD was an ancient pandemic brought to the Roman Empire by troops who were returning from campaigns in the Near East. Scholars have suspected it to have been either smallpox or measles, but the true cause remains undetermined. The epidemic may have claimed the life of a Roman emperor, Lucius Verus, who died in 169. The disease broke out again 9 years later, according to the Roman historian Dio Cassius, and caused up to 2,000 deaths a day in Rome, 1/4 of those who were affected, which gives the disease a mortality rate of about 25%. The total deaths have been estimated at 5 million, and the disease killed as much as 1/3 of the population in some areas and devastated the Roman army. In 166, during the epidemic, the Greek physician and writer, Galen traveled from Rome to his home in Asia Minor, and returned to Rome in 168, when he was summoned by the emperor. He was present at the outbreak among troops stationed at Aquileia in the winter of 168-69. Galen briefly recorded observations and a description of the epidemic. He described the plague as great and of long duration and mentions fever, diarrhea and pharyngitis as well as a skin eruption and sometimes dry and sometimes pustular that appeared on the 9th day of the illness. The information that was provided by Galen did not clearly define the nature of the disease, but scholars have generally preferred to diagnose it as smallpox. The Plague of Cyprian was a pandemic that afflicted the Roman Empire about from AD 249 to 262. The plague is thought to have caused widespread manpower shortages for food production and the Roman army, severely weakening the empire during the crisis. Its modern name commemorates St. Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, an early Christian writer, who witnessed and described the plague. The agent of the plague is highly speculative because of sparse sourcing, but suspects have included smallpox, pandemic influenza and viral hemorrhagic fever like the Ebola virus. In 250 to 262, at the height of the outbreak, 5,000 people a day were said to be dying in Rome. Cyprian's biographer, Pontius of Carthage, wrote of the plague at Carthage. Afterwards there broke out a dreadful plague, and excessive destruction of a hateful disease invaded every house in succession of the trembling populace, carrying off day by day with abrupt attack numberless people, every one from his own house. All were shuddering, fleeing, shunning the contagion, impiously exposing their own friends, as if with the exclusion of the person who was sure to die of the plague, one could exclude death itself also. There lay about the meanwhile, over the whole city, no longer bodies, but the carcasses of many, and, by the contemplation of a lot which in their turn would be theirs, demanded the pity of the passers-by for themselves. The plague nearly saw the end of the Roman Empire, and in the period between AD 248 and 268, the history of Rome is a confusing tangle of violent failures. The structural integrity of the imperial machine burst apart. The frontier system crumbled. The collapse of legitimacy invited one usurper after another to try for the throne. The empire fragmented, and only the dramatic success of later emperors in putting the pieces back together prevented this moment from being the final act of Roman imperial history. Both the threat of imminent death from the plague and the unwavering conviction among many of the Christian clergy in the face of it won many converts to the faith. No one regarded anything besides his cruel gains. No one trembled at the remembrance of a similar event. No one did to another what he himself wished to experience. The Plague of Justinian, from 541 AD to 542 AD, was a pandemic that afflicted the Eastern Roman Empire, and especially its capital, Constantinople, as well as the Sasanian Empire and port cities around the entire Mediterranean Sea, as merchant ships harbored rats that carried fleas infected with plague. Some historians believe the Plague of Justinian was one of the deadliest pandemics in history, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 100 million people, during 2 centuries of recurrence, a death toll equivalent to as much as half of Europe's population at the time of the first outbreak. The plague's social and cultural impact has been compared to that of the Black Death, that devastated Eurasia in the 14th century. According to contemporary sources, the outbreak in Constantinople was thought to have been carried to the city by infected rats on grain ships arriving from Egypt. To feed its citizens, the city and outlying communities imported large amounts of grain, mostly from Egypt. The number of deaths is uncertain. Some modern scholars believe that the plague killed up to 5,000 people per day in Constantinople at the peak of the pandemic. According to one view, the initial plague ultimately killed perhaps 40% of the city's inhabitants, and caused the deaths of up to a quarter of the human population of the eastern Mediterranean. Japanese smallpox epidemic, from 735 AD to 737, was a major smallpox epidemic that afflicted much of Japan. Killing approximately 1/3 of the entire Japanese population, the epidemic had significant social, economic, and religious repercussions throughout the country. All levels of society were affected. Many court nobles perished due to smallpox in 737, including all 4 brothers of the politically powerful Fujiwara clan. Based on fiscal reports, adult mortality for the smallpox epidemic of 735 to 737 has been estimated at 25% to 35% of Japan's entire population, with some areas experiencing much higher rates. The epidemic not only killed a large segment of the population, it triggered significant dislocation, migration, and imbalance of the labor throughout Japan. Highly affected were construction and farming, especially rice cultivation.
The Black Death, also known as the pestilence, was the most fatal pandemic recorded in human history, resulting in the deaths of up to 200 million people in Eurasia and North Africa, peaking in Europe from 1347 to 1351. Plague was the cause. The Black Death was the second plague pandemic recorded, after the Plague of Justinian. The plague created religious, social, and economic upheavals, with profound effects on the course of European history. The Black Death most likely originated in Central Asia or East Asia, from where it traveled along the Silk Road, reaching Crimea by 1347. From there, it was most likely carried by fleas, living on the black rats that traveled on Genoese merchant ships, spreading throughout the Mediterranean basin, and reaching Africa, Western Asia, and the rest of Europe via Constantinople, Sicily, and the Italian peninsula. Current evidence indicates that, once it came on shore, the Black Death was in large part spread by human fleas, and the person-to-person contact via aerosols, which pneumonic plague enables, thus explaining the very fast inland spread of the epidemic, which was faster than would be expected, if the primary vector was rat fleas causing bubonic plague. The Black Death was the second disaster affecting Europe during the late Middle Ages, and is estimated to have killed 30% to 60% of Europe's population. In total, the plague may have reduced the world population from an estimated 475 million to 375 million in the 14th century. The disease may have traveled along the Silk Road with Mongol armies and traders, or it could have arrived via ship. By the end of 1346, reports of plague had reached the seaports of Europe. India was depopulated, Tartary, Mesopotamia, Syria, Armenia were covered with dead bodies. There are no exact figures for the death toll, the rate varied widely by locality. In urban centers, the greater the population before the outbreak, the longer the duration of the period of abnormal mortality. It killed some 75 to 200 million people in Eurasia. The mortality rate of the Black Death in the 14th century was far greater than the worst 20th century outbreaks of plague, which occurred in India and killed as much as 3% of the population of certain cities. It is likely that over 4 years, 45 to 50% of the European population died of the plague. In 1348, the plague spread so rapidly that before any physicians or government authorities had time to reflect upon its origins, about a third of the European population had already perished. In crowded cities, it was not uncommon for as much as 50% of the population to die. Half of Paris' population of 100,000 people died. In Italy, the population of Florence was reduced from 110,000 inhabitants to 50,000 in 1351. At least 60% of the population of Hamburg and Bremen perished, and a similar percentage of Londoners may have died from the disease as well, with a death toll of approximately 62,000. Florence's tax records suggest that 80% of the city's population died within 4 months in 1348. Before 1350, there were about 170,000 settlements in Germany, and this was reduced by nearly 40,000 by 1450. The most widely accepted estimate for the Middle East, including Iraq, Iran, and Syria, during this time, is for a death toll of about a third of the population. The Black Death killed about 40% of Egypt's population. In Cairo, with a population numbering as many as 600,000, and possibly the largest city west of China, between 1/3 and 40% of the inhabitants died inside of 8 months.
Coccolostly epidemic or the Great Pestilence is a term given to millions of deaths in the territory of New Spain in present-day Mexico in the 16th century, attributed to one or more illnesses collectively called coccolostly, a mysterious illness characterized by high fevers and bleeding. It ravaged the Mexican highlands in epidemic proportions. The disease became known as coccolostly by the native Aztecs, and had devastating effects on the area's demography, particularly for the indigenous people. Based on the death toll, this outbreak is often referred to as the worst disease epidemic in the history of Mexico. Subsequent outbreaks continued to baffle both Spanish and native doctors, with little consensus among modern researchers on the pathogenesis. However, recent bacterial genomic studies have suggested that Salmonella, specifically a serotype of Salmonella enterica known as Paratyphi C, was at least partially responsible for this initial outbreak. It might have also been an indigenous viral hemorrhagic fever, perhaps exacerbated by the worst droughts to affect that region in 500 years, as well as living conditions for indigenous peoples of Mexico in the wake of the Spanish conquest. The Great Plague, lasting from 1665 to 1666, was the last major epidemic of the bubonic plague to occur in England. It happened within the centuries-long Second Pandemic, a period of intermittent bubonic plague epidemics. The Great Plague killed an estimated 100,000 people, almost a quarter of London's population, in 18 months. This outbreak of bubonic plague in England is thought to have spread from the Netherlands, where the disease had been occurring intermittently since 1599. It is unclear exactly where the disease first struck, but the initial contagion may have arrived with Dutch trading ships carrying bales of cotton from Amsterdam, which was ravaged by the disease in 1663-1664, with a mortality given of 50,000. The first areas to be struck are believed to be the dock areas just outside London, and the parish of St. Giles. By July 1665, plague was rampant in the city of London. The rich ran away, including King Charles II of England. Businesses were closed when merchants and professionals fled. Defoe wrote, "Nothing was to be seen but wagons and carts, with goods, women, servants, children, coaches filled with people of the better sort, and horsemen attending them, and all hurrying away." As the plague raged throughout the summer, only a small number of clergymen, physicians and apothecaries remained to cope with an increasingly large number of victims. The outbreak was concentrated in London, but it affected other areas as well. Perhaps the most famous example was the village of Eyam in Derbyshire. The plague in London largely affected the poor, as the rich were able to leave the city, by either retiring to their country estates or residing with kin in other parts of the country. The subsequent Great Fire of London ruined many city merchants and property owners. As a result of these events, London was largely rebuilt. The Italian plague of 1629 to 1631 was a series of outbreaks of bubonic plague which ravaged northern and central Italy. This epidemic, often referred to as the Great Plague of Milan, claimed possibly 1 million lives, or about 25% of the population. This episode is considered as one of the later outbreaks of the centuries-long pandemic of bubonic plague which began with the Black Death. The plague may have contributed to the economic decline of Italy relative to other Western European countries. German and French troops carried the plague to the city of Mantua in 1629, as a result of troop movements associated with the 30 Years' War. Venetian troops, infected with the disease, retreated into northern and central Italy, spreading the infection. In October 1629, the plague reached Milan, Lombardy's major commercial center. Although the city initiated effective public health measures, including quarantine and limiting the access of German soldiers and trade goods, the plague smoldered. The city of Venice was severely hit with recorded casualties of 46,000 people out of a population of 140,000. Some historians believe that the drastic loss of life, and its impact on commerce, ultimately resulted in the downfall of Venice as a major commercial and political power. The papal city of Bologna lost an estimated 15,000 citizens to the plague. The Great Plague of Seville, from 1647 to 1652, was a massive outbreak of disease in Spain that killed up to a quarter of Seville's population. It initially struck northern and central Spain and Andalusia in the south. The Great Plague, which may have arisen in Algeria, struck the Mediterranean side of Spain first. The coastal city of Valencia was the first city to be hit, losing an estimated 30,000 people. The disease raged through Andalusia, in addition to sweeping the north into Catalonia and Aragon. The coast of Malaga lost upwards of 50,000 people. In Seville, quarantine measures were evaded, ignored, unproposed, and unenforced. The results were devastating. The city of Seville and its rural districts were thought to have lost 150,000 people. Altogether, Spain was thought to have lost 500,000 people, nearly 5% of its entire population. In 1656, a plague nearly eradicated the population of Naples, Italy. It was prevented by forcible quarantine of the poorer districts and the efforts of a Martinus Ludheim, a visiting physician from Bavaria, Germany. Santa Maria del Pianto was built to commemorate it in 1657. The outbreak of the disease in Naples occurred in January of 1656, when a Spanish soldier, who had arrived from Sardinia, was admitted to the hospital. The alarm was sounded by Giuseppe Bozzetto, who first diagnosed the symptoms. His promptness was not appreciated by the Viceroy's government, which decided to imprison the doctor for having spread the news. The plague, however, can quickly spread its own brand of news. When bodies started piling up, when provisions ran low, when people started fleeing the city, the government was forced to admit the outbreak. That was in May. By August, the plague had run its course. It had killed about half the city's 300,000 inhabitants and at least that many again in the rest of the kingdom. The economic and social effects are obvious, even the people who survived fled the city. No one worked. Even in the countryside, people fled elsewhere, farms went unattended. Law enforcement, in general, was ineffective, and lawlessness spread. The Great Plague of Vienna occurred in 1679 in Vienna, Austria, the imperial residence of the Austrian Habsburg rulers. From contemporary descriptions, the disease is believed to have been bubonic plague. The city was crippled by the epidemic, which recurred fitfully into the early 1680s, claiming an estimated 76,000 residents. Vienna, located on the river Danube, was a major trading crossroads between east and west. The city was crowded and densely built. Descriptions indicate that there were no public sewers or drainage systems, with stinking mounds of domestic garbage littering the streets. In addition, warehouses for trade goods, which held items such as clothing, carpets, and grain for months at a time, were heavily infested with rats. Conditions in the city were considered so unhealthy and filthy, even for the time, that the plague often carried the title, Viennese death, in other parts of Europe. The Great Plague of Marseille was the last major outbreak of bubonic plague in Western Europe. Arriving in Marseille, France in 1720, the disease killed a total of 100,000 people, 50,000 in the city during the next 2 years and another 50,000 to the north in surrounding provinces and towns. While economic activity took only a few years to recover, as trade expanded to the West Indies and Latin America, it was not until 1765 that the population returned to its pre-1720 level. In 1998, an excavation of a mass grave of victims of the bubonic plague outbreak was conducted by scholars from the Université de la Méditerranée. The excavation provided an opportunity to study more than 200 skeletons from an area in Marseille, known as the Monastery of the Observance. Persian plague epidemic of 1772, also simply known as the Persian plague, was a massive outbreak of plague, more specifically bubonic plague, in the Persian Empire, which claimed around 2 million lives in total. It was one of the most devastating plague epidemics in recorded human history. The outbreak resulted in the introduction of several quarantine measures for the first time in the Persian Gulf regions. The epidemic is believed to have started in Baghdad in the winter of 1772. It then spread to other parts of the Persian-controlled lands. By 1773, the epidemic reached Basra, where it proved to be especially devastating, claiming more than 250,000 lives there alone. The plague then quickly spread further southwards along the Persian Gulf, eventually reaching Bahrain. Eastwards, the epidemic extended as far as Bombay in India, modern-day Mumbai. At the peak of the outbreak, 1,000 deaths were recorded on a daily basis all throughout the Persian Empire. The outbreak was contained when imposed quarantine measures among the Persian Gulf populations started to show a positive effect by the end of 1773. Ottoman Plague epidemic was one of the last major epidemics of plaguing the Ottoman Empire. This particular epidemic claimed the lives of at least 300,000 individuals. The disease broke out in the capital Constantinople in July 1812. It was initially mild, but by late August the situation had become critical. By September, around 2,000 people were dying each day. In December the epidemic subsided, but it later reappeared. By the end of the epidemic, it was estimated that there were 320,955 deaths, which included 220,000 Turks, 40,800 Armenians, 32,000 Jews, 28,000 Greeks, 50 Aleppines, 80 islanders and 25 Franks. The outbreak spread throughout most of the empire's territory, including Alexandria in Egypt. In 1813, the plague reached the Ottoman vassal state of Wallachia, where it became known as Karaca's plague after the country's ruler at the time. The epidemic killed about 25,000 to 30,000 people in Bucharest alone. Around the same time, the plague was also present in Bosnia, reaching Dalmatia in 1815. In 1814-15, it reappeared in Egypt, Bosnia and Albania.